Welcome to the Secure Start podcast, brought to you by the Secure Start Aura apps, supporting trauma-informed care and practice at home and in school.
Quite often when we're talking about outcomes, and I'm thinking about within practice, within policy, is that we're talking about outcomes that we can measure and we can count. Because my counter to that is our starting point should be actually speaking to children and young people and young adults and older adults who have experience of the care system about what outcomes are important to you, what should we be thinking about. Quite often what we are missing are outcomes as they relate to relationships, financial readiness, thinking about all of the things that as parents we focus on teaching our children, and actually thinking about hopes and wishes and how young people feel about where they are living and what their hopes are for the future. One of my frustrations when we look at the kind of public and media rhetoric around children's social care is the focus on the negative. And yeah, absolutely, we should call out bad practice. We should call out where things are not working. But ultimately, I don't think we balance that enough with actually, these were some of the aspects that really supported a young person. And I think we need to raise up that rhetoric so that we can learn from what has worked well rather than fixated on this is the problem that we need to solve it. So it's kind of reversing that thinking. So it's not either or, but I think we really need to have both. It is expensive, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be good value for money. However, all the time we just focus on residential care bad, it will be a placement of last resort. We are then not looking at or exploring or understand where there is good quality residential care, where there is really good practice, where there is absolutely those opportunities for human capital. And then when we start to think internationally, as we do have examples where residential care is seen much more as an intrinsic part of child welfare systems, where it's seen as, okay, well, we are using it for this purpose. And so I suppose for me, I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer now, is how do we actually take what we know and try to, again, shift that rhetoric from binary comparisons of the placement type to think about what's the placement purpose and what does this child, young person, need at this point in time, and also what does quality residential care look like. Many of those outcomes are, when there are poor longer term outcomes, they are attributed to residential care. But I don't think there is enough controlling for the point at which residential care is used. Is actually how do we create the quality within the everyday lives of children and young people, and how do we make sure that that is then mirrored across the system rather than just being within a singular placement, which might mean that a young person has quality care and a really positive experience, which we absolutely want. But if it's really short term, then how do we make sure that the wider system and other placements and the whole experience is mirrored? Can we change the narrative from placement type to placement purpose? What is the purpose of the placement? What does the young person want? What does the young person need? Not let's have an ideologically based decision-making process that is also driven by cost.
Welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and joining me for this episode is an internationally recognised leading academic in the field of residential childcare. Before I introduce my guest, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I come to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My guest this episode is Dr. Lisa Holmes. Lisa joined the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sussex in January 2022 as Professor of Applied Science. Prior to this, she was an Associate Professor and Deputy Director of Research in the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. Over the past 25 years, Lisa has carried out a range of research and evaluation projects with a particular focus on the relationship between needs, costs, and outcomes of services and support provided to children and families. Along with her colleagues, Professor James Whitaker and Professor Jorge Duvalier, Lisa is co-chair of the International Work Group for Therapeutic Residential Care and is a board member of the European Scientific Association on Residential and Family Care for Children and Adolescents, and the Association of Children's Residential and Community Services. In late 2022, along with colleagues at the University College London and the University of Oxford, Lisa established the Children's Social Care Data User Group. The group provides a forum to share expertise and learning between all users and potential users, academic, practice and policy, of children's social care, child welfare data. Lisa has published a range of books and journal articles. Over the past 2 years, she has presented her research in Australia, South Korea, Spain, Finland, Croatia, Lithuania, and the US. Well, welcome, Lisa, to the Secure Start podcast. It's been quite a chase for me to get you on here, hasn't it? And I'm really pleased to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks, Colby. Really, really delighted to be with you today. And I'm sorry it's taken a while. I think, as you know, it's my first podcast, so a
Yes.
little bit of a build up for me, but really looking forward to it.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where I'm anxious about it sometimes as well, of course, and some of our guests on the podcast would probably talk about projective identification. And I'm not sure which of us are projecting sometimes, which one of us has got the projective identification. But anyway, it hopefully very quickly we'll both relax into it and it'll all proceed well. I just wonder, and I do this with all of our guests on the podcast. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in residential childcare.
Yeah, so I sometimes talk about this as a bit like going into the family business.
Hmm.
So I grew up in the 1970s with both of my parents working in children's homes, and
Okay.
my early childhood and some of my most pivotal memories were about spending time in my summer holidays in the grounds of the children's homes, and we went on holiday as a family with all of the kids from the children's homes.
Hmm.
And I did volunteering work throughout my adolescent years with children's services, doing youth work, support work. Never really saw myself as having an academic pathway, which feels a little strange where I am now. Um,
Mm.
and was wondering what to do and ended up applying for a job to work in a local authority children's home,
Hmm.
got the role, and that sort of really then sort of piqued my interest even more so actually in terms of working in a children's home and really starting to understand the young people in a
Mm.
different way. And I wasn't that much older than them, but really starting to think about their trajectories into living in children's homes, and then having some of those really poignant conversations with them about their hopes or lack of hope for the
Mm.
future.
Mm. Wow, what a incredible pathway having had that direct kind of immersive experience in residential care from such an early age. Yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah.
guess,
Yeah. So it's been part of my life, all of my life, really.
and I guess I think about, I often think about in my own work and what I've learned working
Hmm.
in the social care space and child protection space for the last 30 plus years. I often think of the young people I've met along the way as being my greatest teachers, and my own children, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
Mm,
I think when I look back, there's certain young people and conversations, both in terms of when I was working in a children's home and then throughout my research. So having
mm,
been an academic for 26 years now, is that there are projects that I have done over the years, young people that I've spoken to in children's homes or in fostering placements and had those conversations with them as part of research that again have just they've stayed with me.
yeah, yeah. And how else would we know the work as well as we do if we actually didn't sit down and interact with and
Yeah.
speak with young people? I mean, that really is the way of getting to the heart of it,
Yeah.
of their experience.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I wonder also about other influences beside the children and young people themselves that have really informed you and your work in this space.
Yeah, and I think I mean that's obviously very much coming from my own upbringing and with the young people. And as I've already mentioned, I'd never really sort of seen myself on an academic pathway, but went off to do an undergraduate degree in psychology and absolutely fell in love with doing research. And I think for me, in terms of then my academic career. At the time, I had no idea, as a sort of very young, naive, um, sort of fledgling academic, is my first ever academic position was with Professor Harriet Ward, who
Mm,
has been doing so much work on outcomes for children in care and children and social care more broadly. And she still, 26 years later, is one of the key people that I would go to if I have a question or if I just want to have a conversation about the work. And she really has inspired me in terms of the research, but has always been there as somebody, as a really sort of genuine mentor.
mm.
And then, I'm not going to give you a whole long list because there have
No,
been so
no.
many people over the years, but I'm also, when I think about my career over the last 26 years, is Harriet also introduced me to Professor Jim Whitaker.
Mm,
And we were at a conference, and Jim and I managed to find 20 minutes together in 2012. And
yeah.
um, saying yes to Harriet that I'd meet with Jim for 20 minutes to talk about how we might do some work together around residential care feels like um, one of the best decisions I've made in the last 26
Mm,
years. And I feel really fortunate now, the stage I am in my academic career, that I still have regular contact and counsel as such with both Jim and
mm.
Harriet.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about Harriet, and I was thinking about the number, as you said it, the number of guests that we've had on the podcast who have talked about um, perhaps what one of their first direct professional influences,
Mhm.
their first supervisor, their
Yeah.
has come up over and over and over, and which has been a really good thing to kind of have almost documented on this podcast
Mm.
for listeners because it reminds people in a leadership role of how influential they can be over the
Yeah.
career trajectory of people who come to work with them.
Absolutely. And I think for me, both Harriet and Jim epitomize, I mean, they are both amazing academics, but it's the principles behind the ways in which they work around kindness, integrity, and always being there to support others, to lift them up. And that's how I always felt, was that essentially off you
Mm,
go. but you're always being held and supported, and that's what we all need in life.
Yeah, some call them containing relationships, and
Hmm.
um, I learnt a new term very recently talking about containment with another guest, epistemological containment,
Hmm.
and like it was just like such a light bulb moment because I thought about when I first went to work as a clinical psychologist, my first
Hmm.
appointment, I was on my own in an office in the a child protection office in the outer northern suburbs of Adelaide, the city I live in,
Hmm.
which was a quite a disadvantaged, compound disadvantaged population, which got a lot of
Hmm.
complexity, and and attachment theory became my
Hmm.
source of epistemological containment because it made the unmanageable feel more manageable
Yep.
in a way. Yeah, yeah. And I wonder if there's been any particularly influential theoretical orientations for you along the way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that feels really quite timely, Colby. So throughout my work, I'm really thinking about children's social care. I've for years highlighted, I think, and have probably bored some people about where people say, well, children's social care systems are too complex, and
Mm,
we need to sort of focus and we need to compartmentalize. And my counter to that is yes, they are complex, but we have to embrace nuance, we have to embrace complexity, and we have to find a way to try and make sense of that. And I think for me, and like so many other people, is Yuri Bronfenbrenner.
mm,
And I use that so much in terms of my thinking about the ways in which children, their carers, their key workers, their families, the whole system are the ways in which they interact and really trying to understand that complexity of the interactions, recognizing that interactions change over time. And you will be very familiar with, and I know I've had conversations with the wonderful Martha Holden. And
mm,
at the moment, I am on sabbatical. And last month, I was absolutely delighted and have come away feeling inspired of actually spending some time with Martha, who is based at the Bronfenbrenner Centre
mm,
at Cornell University. And, again, for me, it just felt like being able to spend just a short period of time during my sabbatical at the Bronfenbrenner Centre at Cornell with Martha Holden and her team um, just felt like such a wonderful opportunity to really, I suppose, not just use that as a theoretical foundation, but to live
mm,
that for a very short period. So, um, yeah, I think I'm at this point in time, I'm still on a sort of that sort of upward feeling of having
mm.
been there and really being able to think and talk about my research.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of your research, you've been really interested, as I understand, in outcomes for children
Hmm.
in out of home care. And I guess one of the first things that I'd like to ask you in relation to that is relates to, I guess, what do you think we misunderstand about what children in care actually need?
Yeah, I mean, I think my starting point for this would be that quite often when we're talking about outcomes, and I'm thinking about within practice, within policy, is that we're talking about outcomes that we can measure and we can count,
Yeah.
um, and or that we answering a kind of along the lines of performance indicators.
Mm.
So we count stability.
Hmm.
So is a child moving from placement to placement? How many placements have they had? And yes, we want to reduce instability,
Mm.
but in terms of outcomes, I suppose my counter to that is our starting point should be actually speaking to children and young people and young adults and older adults who have
Mm.
experience of the care system about what outcomes are important to you. What should we be thinking about
Mm.
measuring? Because actually, it's much more about recognizing that pathways are not always linear. And this is where I get frustrated quite often, where we see some research that attribute certain outcomes to certain placements, but without really recognizing the
Mm.
complexity of everything else that's going on, and also the timing of outcomes. And as I say, it isn't linear. So I
Mm.
think for me, when I'm talking about outcomes and outcome measurements, I mean, I use a lot of the outcome indicators that we have because they are usable for research, but we really need to focus on outcomes that are meaningful. And I'm doing some work at the moment with young care experienced adults, and where we are looking at the outcomes as they are measured by the government in England and actually what is meaningful to them. And there is absolutely an overlap.
Mm.
But quite often, what we are missing are outcomes as they relate to relationships,
Yeah.
financial readiness, thinking about all of the things that as parents we focus on teaching our children,
Mm.
and actually thinking about hopes and wishes and how young people feel about where they are living and what their hopes are for the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah, education would be another one, wouldn't it?
Mhm,
Stability, education, cost, I guess, is an outcome measure that's used in this
mhm,
space. But it goes back to something that I said a little bit earlier, which is, how do we really know the sector unless we
mhm.
talk to the people
Yeah,
in it? We talk to the children.
yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is that there are, if you talk to them, there are other outcomes that are probably a lot more meaningful and important to them
Mhm.
that are much harder to quantify
Yep.
and identify
Mhm,
in a yeah, in numerical form as such. And I'm thinking you'd probably so you mentioned relationships and
mhm,
probably connection. You mentioned preparedness for
mhm.
adulthood. I guess a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. A
Yep.
some of our guests, my guests would have said, we're seeking integrate this in kind of the more psychodynamic language,
Mhm.
integration, an
Yep.
integrated identity for these children. Yeah. What else? Are there other things that you think that I haven't mentioned, you haven't mentioned so far that you think are really important things that we need to be thinking about in terms of outcome?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, it's the interrelatedness, isn't it? So it's also
Mm.
thinking, and when I talk about relationships, again, it's not just about counting the relationships, but I think for me, it's about thinking about how our systems and our child welfare systems tend to be quite rigid. So
Mm.
a child, the expectation is that they move on from a placement or they move on from a school, and then therefore all relationships are severed. But
Mm.
actually, again, thinking about their family and the reasons why they came into care is that sense of identity, belonging comes from knowing who you are, what is
Mm.
happening to you, a sense of agency. Because again, I think this other thing is, thinking about a young person's agency around the decisions that are being made about them, and really then thinking, well, actually, can we look at this in terms of the relational stability? Because that's how we achieve better identity and belonging. And
Mm.
linked to that is thinking about support networks. So we're avoiding, excuse me, loneliness.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, absolutely education. But again, I think what quite often happens is that with education, we focus on education attainment. And yes, we know that in terms of social mobility, we know in
Mm.
terms of um, future employment is there is being able to reach standards that are nationally identifiable in terms of education attainment. But for me, it's beyond that. It's about educational engagement, educational enjoyment. It's also recognizing that if you have an awful lot happening in your life and you are experiencing care, you might be experiencing instability, is what needs to happen so that those foundations are there to be able to achieve in education. And actually, young people need to be able to be supported to engage in meaningful education before they can reach that attainment. And I think it's also about And I mean, again, in terms of measurement, aspiration. So
Mm.
again, we quite often talk about young care leavers, whether they're in education, employment, and training. And some of the work that we're doing at the moment is not just about whether you're in education, employment, and training. Are you in or on a pathway that is taking you to the education, employment, or training that you want to do, not just so that you are earning money. So it's really about, again, comes back to hope and aspiration for the future. And that is so much more difficult to measure, but that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be focusing on it.
I'm so glad that you're saying that in relation to hope, because I do, our children should have hope of
Mm,
having an ordinary life. One of my previous guests, twice over, Della Holmes, she describes it as the great aspiration of children in care is to have
mhm,
an ordinary life. Um, Something else that you said in there that I think is really meaningful here to perhaps tease out a little bit is that we often we have a goal,
mhm,
and I was talking about this recently to someone where in a particular work environment they have the goals that they're looking for, kind of like the aspirational goals, and then they have the outcomes that they
mhm.
think are linked to the goals. And what they don't have is the bit in the middle, which
Yep.
is what does a child need to be able to, you said it, with it, what does a child actually need to be able to
Mhm.
realize those goals, those aspirations for them and demonstrate those outcomes? That's one part of it. The other part of it, of course, is, well, what do we do?
Yep.
What do we do to support those foundations for the young people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's quite often what we see, and I think I've seen this happen more and more so over the last 10, 15 years, well, probably longer than that now, actually,
Mm,
as we've seen austerity globally, and we see that, systems are really struggling,
mhm,
um, is that then when new programs or interventions are being developed, it's very much about we're going to do this, and this is the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Absolutely, that bit in the middle about how it is experienced is
mm,
not always giving us the most clarity. Um, and also the outcomes that tend to then get attributed to whatever that activity is or what the aims are again the outcomes where people get fixated on we're going to save money.
mm.
And again, it's very much about, well, this would be cost effective. And then what quite often you see is the measurement relates to those where you could see the biggest savings.
Yes, that becomes the primary researched
Yeah,
outcome. Mm,
absolutely. And it becomes the primary driver. And we see this with so many policies as well, as
mm.
if we do this, how much money are we going to save?
So what I'm hearing you say is that essentially you cost the outcomes are costed,
Yeah.
and perhaps the most cost effective or inexpensive even outcomes are the ones that get the funding.
Yeah. Or that we focus on the short term. So
Mm,
can we save money in the short term was actually again going back to what we were talking about with children not having linear pathways, that we don't
mm,
necessarily see immediate outcomes. Sometimes things take time, is
mm,
quite often what we see is a short-term focus on, well, within a year or 2 years, how much money is being saved? What's the cost effectiveness of this? Rather than the longer term.
yeah.
And also, I suppose, associated with that is recognizing that who is making the investment as such. So, which part of our public sector are funding these aspects of the work? But then, actually, if the savings are some way downstream, then how do you marry that
Mm,
up in terms of these are
mm,
the different agencies that, and so again, it's this need to really think about the public sector and the public purse as a whole rather than in silos.
mm. And I think you're also getting into, it's interesting. So a number of my early guests had backgrounds in economics before they went into this kind of space, and and we found ourselves, particularly with Graham, a fellow by the name of Graham Kerridge, talking about human capital. And
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm hearing you say is the investment should not be in, this program costs X, this one costs Y, so we'll go with X because it's cheaper uh,
Hmm.
than Y. We need to be taking a longer term view about
Absolutely.
growing human capital,
Hmm.
thinking about things like intergenerational disadvantage and trauma, building capital so that human capital so that generations to come. I think that the work that we do with the child in front of us not
Hmm.
only hopefully is of benefit to that child, but it's of benefit to their life partner and their own
Hmm.
children and potentially their grandchildren as well. That work we do. So what you can apply that, I think, in costs in service provision and thinking
Hmm.
about cost. That the work that we do has that much longer term. If you take that human capital view, it has
Yep.
so many down the stream benefits that ultimately are savings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and that human capital can spread. So again,
Mm,
it's yes, absolutely agree with you in terms of next generations of that family, but also in terms of who we interact with as adults. And
mm,
we started off our conversation today by talking about people that sort of inspire us. And so again, it's the sort of being able to have those examples of where something happened differently and essentially the trajectory was a much more positive trajectory into adulthood, and that human capital and taking that learning to think about actually this is what we should be doing. And I think one of my frustrations when we look at the kind of public and media rhetoric around children's social care is the focus on the negative. And yeah, absolutely, we should call out bad practice. We should call out
mm,
where things are not working. But ultimately, I don't think we balance that enough with actually, these were some of the aspects that really supported a young person. And
yeah.
I think we need to raise up that rhetoric so that we can learn from what has worked well rather than fixated on this is the problem that we need to solve it. So it's kind of reversing that thinking. So it's not either or, but I think we really need to have both.
Yeah, in talking to you, it strikes me that we just that funding bodies, perhaps, and I'm not intending, intentionally wanting to hammer funding or
Mhm.
policymakers or
Absolutely.
those of that ilk, but maybe we sometimes get drawn into focusing over much on some outcomes that really
Yeah.
are not meaningful for the young people and don't build that human capital,
Yeah.
that hope, that belief in their deservedness of an ordinary life, their capacity to make and maintain mutually satisfying relationships, and to be inspired. And as you were talking, I was thinking about we prior to us starting recording, we were talking about Robbie Gilligan. And
Hmm.
when I had Robbie on, he was talking about talking about the influence of extrafamilial adults
Yeah.
who inspired young people,
Yeah.
who took them under their wing, who helped them
Mhm.
out, and in doing so facilitated that path, a trajectory for them. I
Yeah.
also think about just one other person. I think of Louise Allen. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
come across Louise. She's a foster carer there um, in the UK. Quite
Hmm.
quite visible, makes herself very visible, and she also talks about um, some of her other things that does is
Hmm.
around moving the girls that she works with out of poverty into career
Hmm.
pathways out of poverty. And gee, once I start telling these stories, then you get to Kieran Modi, who's done that.
Yep.
at an awesome
Huge
scale
scale.
in India. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we all have those people, don't we? I think it's about absolutely those people that help to lift us up. It's those people who believe in us that then help us to move to a position of self-belief. Which again, as you were talking about Robbie and Louise then, and those other people in our lives, that's why I sort of think back to relational stability is
Mm,
what is it within the children's social care, the child welfare systems, who are those people and how are they involved in young
mm,
people's lives that they can absolutely be there. And we see it so much within society. I mean, it's such a common phrase that we use around it's not what you know, it's who you know. And again,
yes.
it's like, who are those people that give us those opportunities? Who are the people who inspire us? And maybe going off on a little bit of a tangent, but again, thinking about who inspires us and having spent, a few years working in a children's home, I really wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And I really enjoyed working with young people.
Mm,
And I went and spent a few years as a nanny. And I started to live a very different life and had very different influences. And that's what inspired me to go to university. I was first in family. So actually,
mm,
as a first generation academic, it was not something that as growing up, any of us ever talked about. So
mm,
all of a sudden, and so again, it's thinking about people who you come across who
mm,
unexpectedly just kind of tilt your pathway
mm,
in a different way. And I think, had I not had that experience of, being a nanny, which is seen very much as a kind of service industry, um,
mm,
had I not met that family, would I have ever gone to university? And, what would my pathway look like? As
mm.
I say, as a sort of first generation, going off to university.
Yeah, yeah. Look, it, it's the impression I'm getting based on our conversation is it's not too far-fetched to be saying that the goal that we're really trying to achieve for our young people is quality relationships.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a bit, maybe I'm making a bit of a leap here, but I think there is a bit of a link here that, you know, the type of care that you're interested in and we're talking about just happens to be the most expensive form
Yeah.
of care of young people. So it's already um, kind of um, put into the place of the option of last resort. You know, we
Yes.
will do anything before we place a child in a residential care environment because that is costly, but
Hmm.
also that is a poorer or lower, there's a lower standard of care
Yeah.
in that environment. And but it strikes me that the child has a totally different relational experience in residential care, where there's often a number of adults, often younger adults who are more
Yeah.
identifiable for young people. I'm not going to answer my own question, but
Yeah.
what I think that this, yeah, if we tilt it a bit and we think
Mhm.
about relationships as being more important, growing human capital as being
Yeah.
more important, I wonder then how we think about the cost and the place of residential care in the spectrum of care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's no disputing residential care is expensive. And
Mhm.
I remember evaluating a model of residential care here, and then standing up at the final event. And the first thing I said is that, it's expensive, and you can see everybody's faces sort of,
Yes, bed.
goodness, where is she going with this? Um, It is expensive, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be good value for money. Now, not all
Yes.
residential care is good value for money. Um, but I think the other, and I come back to my earlier point about complexity and nuance. And I think what frustrates me is quite often when people are talking about residential care, we get very fixated on a binary comparison, which is focused on
Mm,
placement type, as if residential care is a homogenous placement.
mm,
Whereas actually residential care is hugely variable.
Mm.
And I can't sit here and pretend that there isn't really bad practice in
No.
residential care, and there absolutely is. And some young people have really bad experiences, they are exploited. We know that there's lots of historical reviews and
Mm.
inquiries. However, all the time we just focus on residential care bad, it will be a placement of last resort. We are then not looking at or exploring or understand where there is good quality
Mm.
residential care, where there is really good practice, where there is absolutely those opportunities for human capital. Um,
Mm.
but I would also say quite often when we're talking about that, I do feel like it's very much about sort of swimming against the tide. And I think as an academic
Mm.
looking at this, I feel that. And then I stop and think about actually for young people, and we focus on the rhetoric within our societies is quite often we'll see it in the media here about residents are putting objections into a new a children's home opening because of the criminal contagion, and they're
Mm.
scared for their own children. They don't want the residential children's home within their community. This is a placement of last resort, and I find that really frustrating. So I then just try and think about actually, if you are a young person who knows you are going to live in a children's home and all around you, the rhetoric is this is placement of last resort. This is where we place children where we don't know where else to for them to live. These are the placements that nobody wants within their own community. Is how do you experience, how do you feel as a young person that that is going to be the next place you are going to be living? And how do you move from that to something where you can develop human capital? Because actually, that starting point is so negative. And then when we start to think internationally, as we do have examples where residential care is seen much more as an intrinsic part of
Mm.
child welfare systems where it's seen as, okay, well, we are using it for this purpose. And so I
Yeah.
suppose for me, I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded answer now, is how do we actually take what we know and try to, again, shift that rhetoric from binary comparisons of the placement type to think about what's the placement purpose and what does this child, young person, need at this point in time? And also, what does quality residential care look like?
Yeah.
What is the environment? Who are the workforce? What is the everyday lived experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get, you've asked those questions. I was going to ask them. We'll get to them in a moment. But I not only think about the children, like the children's image. It was Paul Van Hisswick recently who brought up a quote from Winnicott, which
Hmm.
is, "I look and I am seen, so I exist. I look and I am seen, so I exist." And very much that idea of mirroring, the adults around the
Hmm.
child being mirrors for the child, of
Yeah.
how they look to the child is becomes
Hmm.
and I came at that idea not from Winnicott, but from the symbolic interactionists and the idea of the looking glass self
Yeah.
through my education um, I also I worry a lot about the adults. We I worry when people come out very negatively in the media, for
Hmm.
example, or even just that attitude that permeates down through
Hmm.
organisations where everyone knows that this is the option of last resort. We devalue those adults as well.
Yeah.
And adults are working with some of our most vulnerable children. Like,
Yeah.
why would we do that? Why would we
Hmm.
devalue the work of those adults?
Uh, yeah, absolutely. And that's it, is we're not investing in the workforce because again, if all the time the rhetoric is this is a placement of last resort, and as you've
Mm.
already said, Colby, these are the children in our society with some of the most complex needs. And several years ago, I wrote more of a kind of debate think piece with the wonderful Christopher Belancy, who's done a lot of work with Jim Whittaker, Jim Anglin, and others in the US and North America. Is that actually, and we called it the greater needs, the lesser the evidence.
Mm,
Because actually, in terms of residential care, quite often the studies are either really, really small scale or they are the longer term measurement of outcomes where they're being attributed to residential care, which might be a very short intervention. And we get that sort of that usual rhetoric of residential care leads to all of these poor
mm,
adult outcomes. But actually, what we're not getting is that real investment in doing the research about the workforce, what it is to work within um,
mm,
children's homes. And again, going back to Martha Holden and the work that the Residential Childcare Project have been doing for so many years about really recognizing the workforce,
yeah.
those working in residential care, and the need for training, and not
Mm,
just qualifications before you start working in residential care, the ongoing training, the support, understanding trauma, understanding the needs of young people. And then the other aspect of that as well is what we do know from the literature and the evidence is the importance of high quality supervision and
yeah.
recognizing that the workforce, they can't just hold all of this. They need to have those
Mm,
outlets and they need to be supported so that they can work well with the young people.
yeah. Yeah. And as a little aside, I feel exactly the same way about our child protection workforce
Yeah.
as well. The work they do is so incredibly complex, and they are, they're beaten around from pillar to post, really, figuratively.
hmm
They're unsupported. They're often criticised. They're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And yeah, I can't see that there's any good that comes out of this for children. Those people who are banging the drums for the children.
hmm
Yeah, yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. For the adults, I was thinking a little bit about those questions that you've put forward a little bit earlier. One was about and I was thinking purposeful, but
hmm
understanding the purpose of residential care and being
hmm
purposeful about it. And
Yeah.
I was also thinking about, and I'm talking too long now, and I'm going to get wrapped over the knuckles by my supervisor. But I was thinking about how there are children in the system where it should be an option of first resort.
hmm
And I think particularly about the children who have been deeply hurt in within families who need a break from a family environment. And there's research I know that
Yeah.
suggests that they don't want to be in a family environment. They'd rather be in a
Absolutely.
congregate
Yeah.
environment. Mm.
hmm Yeah. And again, thinking back to some of the young people involved in research that I've done over the years is I still remember very early on in my career interviewing a young girl living in a children's home. And for her, she absolutely did not want to be in a fostering household.
Hmm.
Um, and again, it comes back to, yeah, who is speaking to the young person when a placement is needed at that first entry to care. And also I think the use of residential care placements to support reunification, because again, it's sort of understanding why is the child coming into care? And again, because we get fixated on it, this is really expensive. But actually, if it's short term, has anybody sat there and said, well, actually, for this young person and for this family and what they are experiencing at this point in time, a short placement in residential care can then support reunification. But again, I think it's this sort of thinking of the linear pathways rather than being able to do things flexibly. And again, that's partly because it would be expensive to
Yes,
do it in that way.
in the short
In the
term.
short term, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
And I think it's like you're reading my mind. I totally agree with you. I think that residential care can be used purposefully in
Yes.
support of family reunification.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, and I just yeah, I guess that's one of the things I'd like to see more and more happen in my local jurisdiction. And even if I can
Mhm.
find some jurisdictions who do it that way, I'd love to have them on here on the podcast. One thing I did that did come across my mind again while you were speaking
Mhm.
was the research on outcomes, and I wonder to what extent does it control for the confound. So I'm talking about the ones that compare foster care versus residential care.
Mhm.
How much does that research control for the confounding influence of the children having been in foster care before they went into residential care?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I don't think that it does
No.
sufficiently. And I think again, um, I come back to some of my earlier points is many of those outcomes are when there are poor longer term outcomes, they are attributed to residential care. But I don't think there is enough controlling for the point at which residential care is used. I think the other thing that I have found frustrating, and again, I think, every time we're doing some research and we're learning, we have to take that learning and think about, okay, well, what has it helped us with, and what else do we really need to understand in more detail? Um, but equally, when some of those longitudinal analyses that maybe go back to the 70s and 80s, etc., are
Mm,
looking at adult outcomes, my question there is not only about exploring confounding variables like the previous placements, but also
mm,
recognizing that children's residential care in the 90s and 70s and 80s looks very different to residential care
mm,
now. Um, and so, I just don't feel like there is enough consideration of that wider context and all of the, I suppose, within, and I use our administrative data sets. They're a great resource for research, but there's some research questions that they can't answer because they don't have either sufficient information about the care pathway prior to residential care, or they don't have sufficient information. So, for example, quite often within administrative data sets, we don't have good data about disabilities. And again, if we think about
mm,
children with diagnosed disabilities, um, the use of residential care is very different.
mm,
So I suppose I come back to my point without wishing to sound like a broken record about nuance and complexity is when we start to do some of those studies where we're focusing on the variables that we can use for the long-term analysis that we can count, that we can compare, is how much of that nuance and complexity is being stripped away and what is being lost in those analyses.
mm.
And I'm also just thinking in terms of your future guests, Professor Rick Hood, who's based at University of Kingston in England. I don't know if you've come across his work, but
I
he's
will.
doing some analysis at the moment, which I think is going to be great in terms of helping to build some of our knowledge around this. So that's my recommendation for you to have Rick on at a later point.
Okay. Now, I'm just aware that the sun is going down here and it's suddenly getting dark. I'm just going to go and put a light on and I'll be back
Okay.
in a moment. Sorry about that. I'd hate to think that there's a comparison being made between foster care and residential care in which some of the young people in the residential care group have been through three or four or five or 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 family-based placements
Mhm.
before they got there. And then we're
Yeah.
saying, well, residential care is clearly the lesser care option here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also about, and I remember doing some longitudinal analysis probably sort of 10, 15 years ago. Um, and at the time looking at it was an intervention in foster care, but looking at the length of time the children experienced it. Um, and we ended up, as we were doing the analysis and we were trying to make sense of the data, we ended up using the term dosage, which isn't something I would ordinarily use in terms of children's social care and the dosage of a particular way of working or placement. But actually, what we were finding in terms of trying to attribute outcomes is that most children had experienced that very specific type of placement for less than a month.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, if we're thinking about trajectories, pathways through care systems. If you have got children who have experienced foster placement after foster placement and then a residential placement, and then maybe they move back to a foster placement, is
Mm.
how long are each of those? And actually, are we trying to attribute an outcome to a specific placement, which might be very short, or are we trying to attribute outcomes to what their trajectory looked like in terms of the amount of instability that they have experienced and actually just this whole pathway of moving between the different types of placements? And we go back to the earlier conversation we had about identity, belonging, relationships. Is how do
Yes.
you have any of that if your life is spent moving between
Mm.
all of these different placements? And then throw into the mix children also changing school.
Mm-hmm.
Is, actually, how do you just put a pause on that type of pathway to help that young person to say, well, this is not good enough,
Mm.
and how do we actually get everything in place to change this?
Well, maybe I think maybe that I don't, this is not necessarily a criticism of you, or because it's not what we're talking about here, but I do think that what we need to be doing is not looking at comparing foster care and
Yeah.
residential care. We need to be looking at what the children need and
Yes.
how are we realizing attainment with the
Mhm.
care options that we have, and
Yeah.
with the care options that are most appropriate to their needs.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the starting point is what is the purpose? So why are
Mm,
we making this decision for what purpose?
mm,
And, again, quite often when we have sort of wider discussions and debates, we focus on sustainability, we focus on placement availability. And actually, if it's availability of placements that's driving decision making rather than needs. So it's, for me, it's about the children, young people's needs, and it's about the purpose of that placement.
yeah.
But that's, I mean, I suppose it's very easy for me to sit here and say that when I'm not living this as an everyday kind of practitioner or manager. It's not
Mm,
easy. And I think we've reached that point at the moment where we know from the analysis that so much more of the money around children's social care is going on late intervention because it's shifted because we've been so
mm,
much more reactive. We know that um, money is not being used effectively where it's going off to private providers where they are not reinvesting back
mm,
into the child welfare systems. So that context is really difficult. But again, it kind of comes back to if we just focus on what's difficult, we lose sight of
yeah.
the children.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what does good quality residential childcare look like?
So yeah, so am I allowed to do a bit of a plug for the international summit that we are hosting
Absolutely.
on
Yeah,
this?
absolutely.
Um, so yeah, absolutely, and I think that our international work group on therapeutic residential care that I co-convened with Jim Whitaker and Jorge de Vallier, um, we, along with our much wider group, and I'm not going to name everybody, is we have been trying to focus on residential care, what constitutes quality, and that is trying to focus on the environment, it's to focus on the children's experience, but also the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are hosting an international summit here in sunny Brighton in England in September to really try to open up those conversations and to look at the latest evidence, to have input from practitioners, to have input from young people who have experienced residential care to all come together to think about, okay, well, what are those different components around what constitutes
Mm,
quality? And we know some of it, but again, it's about how does this all come together within the context of those wider systems? And then, I come full circle on the podcast to, having talked about Ron from Brenner and thinking about that wider context is actually how do we create the quality within the everyday lives of children and young people, and how do we make sure that that is then mirrored across the system rather than just being within a singular placement, which might mean that a young person has quality care and a really positive experience, which we absolutely want. But if it's really short term, then how do we make sure that the wider system and other placements and the whole experience is mirrored? And as I say that, it feels quite ideological. But it doesn't mean to say that, we talk about aspirations for young people. And I think for those of us, whether we're academics, practitioners, or policymakers working in the field, that surely we should have aspirations for how our work could try to drive things forward for the future.
Absolutely. And when you were talking, going through each of those groups, I was thinking parents as well. And
Yeah,
I was thinking, we 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 should, you touched on this a little bit earlier, which is that we should be thinking about outcomes for the children.
yeah,
The outcomes that we should be looking at are the same outcomes that we would apply in our own families with our own children.
absolutely. Yep.
Not, there's no, and that transcends kinship care,
Yep.
residential care, foster care,
Hmm.
foster adoption.
Yep.
It trans it it's just it is what we want is
Yep.
for them to have a a healthy growing environment that supports them to achieve to their potential,
Hmm.
um, to heal where they need to heal. And
Yep.
we
Absolutely.
need to get away from, yeah, it seems to me we need to get away from a fixed and rigid idea of what type of care
Yes.
care modality in a sense
Hmm.
is better or less good, and more on just the quality of the care and its capacity to facilitate those outcomes, those universal outcomes that we want
Hmm.
children: sense of established sense of identity, sense of belongingness, a sense of their own worth to others.
Yep.
And
Absolutely agree.
and we have and if we do that, and to do that, we have to invest in the adults who, whether they're foster carers, kinship carers, residential carers.
Yeah.
We need to invest in them, I think.
Hmm.
Mm,
Yeah, we need to invest and we need to believe. And again, I think I come back to my earlier point about, how do we make sure that those examples and those experiences are as part of the public discourse.
yeah. You rarely see a good news story about residential care in the media.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it seems to me that the public perception is decades, because you referred to, back in the old days, there were really bad things that happened
Hmm.
in, yeah, but the public perception is very much out of sync, and perhaps even policymaker and perceptions are very much dated and out of sync
Hmm.
with what we now know about and what we have observed to be really good, high quality residential care
Hmm.
that produces good outcomes for young people.
Yes.
I wonder
Yeah,
what you'd say to the
absolutely.
policymakers. I wonder what if what's his name, Josh McAllister, the
Alistair.
children's minister there in the UK. What would you say to Josh?
I I think that quite often that our thinking and policies are driven by ideologies. And
Mm.
yes, I mean, ideally we wouldn't be using
Group care.
residential care in the way that we're having to, but we do. And I think that it's more about understanding. Yeah, I think I would go right back to it feels like such a simple thing to say is, can we change the narrative from placement type to placement purpose? So
Yes.
actually, as children are requiring a placement, what is the purpose of this?
Mm,
And how do we do it in a way that we think about what's the purpose? If they're having to be placed in a child welfare system, then what are the options? What are the ways in which we're thinking about this so we can actually think about this is the purpose, not this. I mean, again, we hear the term failing up to residential care, such a horrible term, just like the last resort. And, as I
mm,
say, I think for me, I would go back and say, it is what is the purpose of the placement? What does the young person want? What does the young person need? Not
mm,
let's have an ideologically based decision-making process that is also driven by costs. And we know that money is
mm,
limited. But again, it's very much the short-term costs rather than going back to your point, Colby, about human capital and
mm.
how do we do that in the longer term?
It seems overly convenient that the idea that the best place for children to grow up is a family environment just happens to be the cheapest or the least
Mhm.
expensive
Yeah.
form of care. And I'm 31 years into my career as clinical psychologist working in child protection and out of home care and related endeavours, and um, the children who struggle in they've been hurt in families,
Mhm.
they've been
Yeah.
hurt in family-based environments, and then I think they get that more their harm is done to them by subjecting them to 5, 10, 20, 30 family-based placements that they feel overwhelmed in and break
Hmm.
down. And
And they
I think that
experience more rejection
mm,
and breakdown. And and then it's the cumulative impact, isn't it, of that level of
mm,
the severing of relationships after relationships after relationship,
yeah,
rather than thinking about actually, should we do things a bit differently here?
yeah. And then of course we look at the children. I, just the level. I don't think people have the time to sit and think about, reflect, like in supervision, because I think
Hmm.
sometimes systems blame the birth parents for how out of sorts the children are,
Hmm.
notwithstanding that the children have been through 10 placements, 10 family-based placements. It stopped being entirely to do with the family, the
Hmm.
original family environment
Yeah.
a long time ago, if they've been through 10 placements. And I don't want to sound like I'm hard on everyone, but I do think it is important to think purposefully rather
Hmm.
than ideologically, as you say. I think
Yeah.
that's a really, really accurate way of putting it. And want to come back to your conference in
Hmm.
September, and I'm wondering if you were talking about the conference being about, they're always about making connections, but bringing
Hmm.
together people to um, to really flesh out what good quality and purposeful use of residential care looks like.
Yeah.
And how will that be conveyed afterwards? Do you think, like, how does that get out into systems
Yeah.
worldwide? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, I would like to. So we have, as an organising committee, we have been talking about the legacy of
Mm,
the summit, because we are. So I suppose there's one thing about in terms of the structure of the event is we see lots of academic conferences have lots of very short presentations. What
mm,
we're going for is much more discursive workshops, where we're
mhm,
talking about a specific issue. So, for example, outcome measurement,
mm,
about the integration and the benefits of the integration of research within practice, um, and having a couple of examples from different countries. So each workshop is not just focused on a specific country, but has the different countries. So I suppose the starting point is very much if we start from a position of looking at similarities, how do we learn together? In
mm,
terms of the legacy, we will be working on a special issue from the summit that will
mm,
be published in Residential Treatment for Children and Youth, which is edited by Bethany Lee. And the editorial team, which feels rather nice for me, is I'll be editing that with Jim Whitaker and Jorge de Valier. So the three of us will be coming back together. But we've also been talking about how we might have some videos and other ways in which we can make sure that those conversations are available more broadly, and that there is that legacy so that others can come back to them. So again, looking at having materials available on the ACRC website after the summit. And it's, it's a single event, but hopefully it will inspire and make those connections, and then through those connections there'll be more collaborations and hopefully future research.
Yeah. Terrific. That's well, I know we've communicated about it previously, and I'd love to come.
We'd love to have you.
The world's become a little bit more complicated since then.
It has. Yes.
We tend to, from Australia, we tend to fly over the Middle East and stop in, change planes in the Middle East. That's probably the most popular route. So I don't know that it's going to happen, but if it can happen, I'd love to get back. I haven't been back since 2018, actually.
Okay.
I used to go every year, and then I had a year off in 2019, and then the world changed. Yeah, and I haven't been back.
Yeah, current global situation is not good for a whole host of reasons, but certainly with travel is makes things more complicated.
Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Lisa, and worth all the chasing down after you and finally getting you here. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thank you. I've really, really enjoyed it. So thank you.